Hello and welcome to another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, it's a quick Timberwolves trade deadline primer. We're just a couple weeks away. We'll talk about what to expect at the deadline, possibly for Minnesota, what they might be able to do. We'll run through tradable assets, draft assets, what the limitations are for being over the second apron. We'll also look at the new three big lineup. Will Chris Finch deploy it more moving forward? And we'll preview tonight's Wolves-Suns game. It's a packed show, all upcoming. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is sponsored by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Happy Hump Day and happy Timberwolves game day. The Wolves are on the first night of a back-to-back on the road tonight in Phoenix. We'll talk about that matchup here toward the end of the show. But a lot to get to. First, I want to talk trade deadline. I want to talk three big lineup, Randle, Naz, and Rudy. All that here in the first couple segments of today's show before we get to tonight's game. Big thank you, though, off the top for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And a reminder, you can subscribe to the daily newsletter at LockedOnDaily.com. That's right, a daily Locked On Wolves newsletter. Some notes from this show. You'll also get some additional links to more Wolves coverage and some around the NBA coverage too. Subscribe at LockedOnDaily.com. All right. Believe it or not, the trade deadline is just around the corner. It is earlier than it used to be. Of course, they made that change a couple of years ago, but the deadline's upcoming. It is February 6th, which is like next Thursday, I believe. Pretty sure it's next Thursday. I'm going to make sure that I'm right about that. Yeah, next Thursday at 2 p.m. So before the All-Star break, like we're there. We're pretty much there. I talked about it with Dukowitz on Friday. We talked a little bit about last Friday's show. We talked about his thoughts on the deadline from over at Zone Coverage, the article he'd written, and like what he thinks may or may not happen. I think he put his percent chance of a trade at like 10%. I'm probably about in the same range, and I'll explain why. I want to spend most of the time just kind of talking about like assets that the Wolves have and, potential deals. There's actually a couple good ESPN articles over the past few days regarding assets that each team has. So like there's an article from Bobby Marks that posted on Tuesday morning that was called like trade deadline tiers, deal scenarios, and outlooks for all 30 teams. So for the Wolves, I'll start here. Okay. Well, actually, let's do this. Let me set the stage for the second apron, and then I want to go to the ESPN article. So the restrictions the Wolves have right now, the biggest thing is that they can't aggregate contracts, meaning they can't trade multiple guys. So they can't trade Julius Randle and another guy to take back a bigger contract because the NBA was trying to limit the super teams, right? They can't send cash, which is less of a big deal. They can't take back more money than they send out. Usually it used to be there was like a percent on either side. It could be within, but the Wolves have to send out more than they take in. Those are the biggest restrictions. Or that's the biggest impact. So that makes things pretty complicated for Minnesota to make a trade. They can't take in more money and they can't send out more than one guy at a time. So ESPN's Bobby Marks has an article where he says he lists every team. So for the Wolves, he says, keep an eye on Julius Randle. He talks about how he has all the stuff we've talked about ad nauseum about how the Wolves are worse this year with Randle than they were with Cat. We know that. Then he says, finding another trade partner to improve the offense takes creativity and sacrificing a starter, perhaps Randle. The forward has a $33 million salary this season and a $30.9 million player option next season. Randle is allowed to be traded, but because of the second apron rules, Minnesota cannot aggregate contracts and they can't use more than 100% of the traded player exception. 6 out of the next 7 Timberwolves first-round picks are controlled by Utah and San Antonio. There were a couple of those picks were just recently traded. The Timberwolves have 2 picks that could be in the top 35 of this year, however. Remember, the Wolves in the Towns trade, they got a top 13 protected first from Detroit. That pick may convey to Minnesota this year. They also have Utah's second-round pick, and Utah is bad. So that's very likely going to be a top 5 pick in the second round this season, which is why Mark says they could have 2 picks in the top 35, which is that's significant. Now they don't have their own pick, remember. So it's funny because Mark says to keep an eye on Randle, and then he goes on to say, here's a trade that works. Minnesota gets Torrey Craig, and Chicago gets Leonard Miller and a 2029 conditional second-round pick. I don't know. I mean, Torrey Craig's been hurt this year. The depth is nice. I mean, I guess we find out. It's funny with the deadline being so soon, the DiVincenzo injury, and at recording this now, like Nickeil Alexander-Walker's questionable to play Wednesday. Apparently avoided really serious injury in Monday's game. But like, it's possible the Wolves look at this and go, look, this is the deadline's now. DiVincenzo may not play for close to a month. Maybe they do make a move like that and trade a young player like a Leonard Miller, less likely like a Josh Minott or Jalen Clark, because those guys probably have more value at this point. Minott to the Wolves now, Jalen Clark in the future, than Leonard Miller, just because he is still a project. So maybe they consider that for a depth rotation type guy like a Torrey Craig, who Marks points out has been very good in the postseason in his career. I don't know how much that matters or should factor into this, but maybe it does. It wouldn't necessarily for me, but if the Wolves feel like depth is another piece of wing depth is important, then we could see a move like this. We could see a future second plus a Leonard Miller traded for a guy like a Torrey Craig. That's the only real thing the Wolves can do besides the Julius Randle trade. I mean, like, there's no other, I don't want to spend too much time on this. Like, obviously Gobert and they're not going anywhere. Naz is not going to be traded. He's got the player option that he's not going to pick up. Like, he's going to be a free agent, but why would the Wolves trade Naz? That makes no sense. Obviously, DiVincenzo is not going to be moved. I know at one point there were rumors that that was never going to happen. They were never going to trade DiVincenzo. That contract is too valuable, and now he's hurt anyway. Nobody's trading for Mike Conley. They're not trading Rob Dillingham. Nickeil's a bargain. They're not trading him. They're probably not trading TJ Shannon at this point. He's hurt anyway. They're like, Garza actually has a veto or a no trade. They're not trading Garza. They're not trading Joe Ingles. Like, the only assets they have are, you could argue Jaden McDaniels. I'd be floored if they traded Jaden McDaniels. He's the only guy I didn't mention. So Jaden is like a 1% chance to be traded. Everybody else I just listed is like basically a 0% chance. Jaden would be not much more than a 0% chance. Because also, like, well, I don't want to go down that path. The other guys, Minott, Miller, Jalen Clark, who actually is on a 2-way, so that complicates that, I guess. It's possible those guys could get traded with a second-round pick. I guess theoretically possible Joe Ingles could get traded. I don't know why. I guess unless you're taking, like, no, that wouldn't make sense because they can't take back. Yeah, I mean, like, there's really nothing else. Unless you're trading Randle or Minott or Miller plus a pick, you're not getting anything back. A Randle deal would obviously be a big one. I saw Jeremy Grant floated. I think actually that may have been an idea that Dukowitz had on Friday. Perhaps that's a possibility, but it's just pretty unlikely that they do anything. Because it has to be, somebody has to be interested in acquiring Julius Randle as well. And maybe there's fear that he picks up his player option. You got to pay him $31 million next year, or maybe a team's worried he's going to opt out. Like, the player option really complicates things. And especially now that the Wolves offense has been better since the first of the year, Randle's like fit a little bit better. This team's trending in the right direction. They're very likely going to be a top 5 seed in the West. I believe that. Like, at this point, you just play it out. If Randle opts in, you can always trade him in the offseason. If he opts out, you can let him walk, or you can re-sign him, hopefully not at a crazy deal. But I would be pretty surprised if they traded Julius Randle at this point. I'm sure there'll be rumors. I'm sure they'll have conversations. I don't think it's likely. And that's really the only move they can make. In terms of other draft capital, I want to talk about that briefly next. I won't spend a lot of time on that, but we can look at like the total picture of draft capital, which I mentioned a minute ago. For this year, it's actually better than you might expect. So I want to do that, and then we'll move on from that, and we'll get into some lineup stuff before we preview Wolves Suns for tonight. That's what we got on tap here for the rest of the show. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at Game Time. Attending NFL playoff games is an unforgettable experience that brings fans together. I actually did go to an NFL playoff game a few years ago, which was a ton of fun and not something you're ever going to forget. It was a game actually in the Metrodome, so a long time ago, but it was a ton of fun going to a playoff game in the Metrodome, I promise. And I'm sure it would be the same at US Bank Stadium. Well, guess what? You can attend NFL playoff games. At this point, we're down to the Super Bowl, but you can do all that through Game Time. Like that's the best platform to get your playoff tickets for any sport, really. Game Time has a new feature now called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for events even easier. It filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. I recently used Game Time Picks to find tickets for, it wasn't an NFL playoff game this time around, for a baseball game, actually, back in the fall. Early fall, and browsing through deals to find those tickets was super simple. And Game Time Picks can help you find what makes the most sense for you. You can find great value for all kinds of seats around the venue. The super deal is always especially impressive, offering the best value for the event. The app's features like seat views before you buy and all-in pricing with no surprise fees at checkout make the experience smooth and reliable. Plus, the on-time ticket delivery and lowest price guarantee will give you peace of mind. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA. That's LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. All right, so putting a bow on the draft or the trade conversation, the Timberwolves, there's an ESPN article. This one was also by Bobby Marks, related to NBA draft asset rankings. The Wolves are 25th, which might surprise some folks because everyone just knows they traded a bunch for Rudy Gobert. But they also got back that protected Detroit pick, which is top. Let's see. I said the last article said top 13 protected. This article says top 14 protected. So we're going to have to track that down. But top 13 or 14 protected first from Detroit. If it doesn't convey this year, it's top 11 protected next year and top 9 protected in 2027. That pick is tradable if they wanted to trade it. And they have a pick swap in 2026 that they can, I think, can still trade because it's a swap. I think it could trade one of the two of those. And then they have picks in 28 and 30 that they cannot change. So the only tradable pick, actually, let me take that back. They can't trade their own pick in 26 because they traded their pick in 25 and 27. So the tradable pick that they have is this year's protected Detroit pick, either top 13 or 14 protected. And then they own their own picks in 26, 28, and 30. So it's funny, like 27 is the only draft in the next 4 years the Wolves don't have a first-round pick, as much as everyone wants to, and they didn't, I guess, this year, but as much as we, or I guess they did this year, and they traded up to get Dillingham. As much as people want to rip on the Gobert trade and what they gave up, they're about to still make a first-round pick in 4 out of 5 drafts. So anyway, also they have a bunch of second-round picks, and I mentioned earlier that they have that top 35 second round pick because it's the Jazz pick this year. So the Wolves actually have more draft assets than you might think. And even, obviously nowhere near compared to obviously nobody's anywhere near Oklahoma City, who has just an unbelievable amount of first round picks. They have 13 first round picks and they can trade up to 10 of them, which is just nuts considering they're a top, 3 team in the NBA right now. Anyway, so I don't think it's likely the Wolves make a trade. I'd probably put it at 5%. And I think if they do, it's not Julius Randle. I think it's Monat or Miller plus a second rounder for a depth, veteran type guy. I think it's more likely the Wolves play the buyout market / waiver wire here moving forward. They can play a little bit with that roster spot. Remember, they waived PJ Dozier. They've got two-way contracts they could mess with. I think that's far more likely for Minnesota than pulling off a trade at this stage. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. All right, let's talk about the Timberwolves big man lineup, the three big lineup that Chris Finch rolled out for only like the second time all year here in the win on Monday night. And that is Randle, Naz, and Rudy together on the floor. They had done it previously with Anthony Edwards and Nickeil Alexander-Walker. And in this game, they played with Mike Conley and Nickeil Alexander-Walker for all of it, because Ant was on the bench for his rest stint at the beginning of the fourth. The previous 6 possessions that they played with Ant, Nickeil, and the three bigs were mostly unsuccessful. These 9 possessions they played together, I think they went on a 12-4 run, and they were especially good offensively. Actually, they were good at both ends of the floor, but a really impressive unit. And I wonder if it's possible we see a little bit more of it, especially with the Dante DiVincenzo injury, because we're talking about, a head coach who wants to keep his rotation tight. Yes, we saw some Josh Minott minutes. We saw some extra Rob Dillingham rotation minutes. And who knows if Nickeil's hurt, maybe it's even more likely we see this group with like Ant and Dillingham in the backcourt. But I like that trio on the floor with Mike Conley. The Conley-Gobert chemistry we know is strong. I know Conley and Randle struggled early in the year, but having Conley on the floor to help get the ball to where it needs to be on time and on target, and then having Alexander Walker spacing with that group, ideally, and it can be Dillingham if it needs to be, but then you might be hard up defensively if you don't have Alexander Walker out there, because that's not a good perimeter defense group, right? Conley, if it's Conley, Dillingham, Randle, Naz, and Gobert. Like, Naz can hold his own on the perimeter, but he's not Jaden McDaniels on the ball. And Rob Dillingham is not Nickeil. Rob Dillingham is not even Ant defensively, right? So that would make me a little bit nervous defensively. But like, if Nickeil's out, I don't know that we see those three guys play together on the floor. But the size and the ability to offensive rebound potentially and give yourself some extra possessions, and the floor spacing of Naz. I mean, because Naz can shoot the way that he does, he can play the 3. Like, that's what he does in these lineups. And Randle can play the 4. Gobert can play the 5. And Naz provides an element offensively that obviously Jaden McDaniels does not. And that's going to be a more offensively focused lineup than defensively focused. But because Gobert's on the floor, it's still going to allow you to remain competitive defensively. And like I said, I don't think we see that trio play without Nickeil. I think he's essential to making that work because he's the right blend of 3 and D. Jaden isn't enough offense, and he's not going to like to play the 2. That's not going to happen. You could go Conley and Ant with that group, but I think it has to be Conley and Ant or Conley and Nickeil. I don't think you can do Dillingham. I don't think you can do McDaniels. So their options are a little bit limited, especially if Alexander Walker is out for any stretch of time. But I kind of liked it. Like, that trio together, and especially it made a ton of sense on Monday because against the Hawks, because it was like they were clearly the Wolves' 3 best players in the game, so it made sense to have them play together. And even if it was kind of forced, like, it worked. So I'm curious to see if Finch does it moving forward. And I mean, we could compare it to the 3 big lineup from last year. It's not really a fair comparison, but I'm going to anyway, because why not? So last year, Gobert, Naz, and Cat together. Is that what I wanted to do? Yeah, Gobert, Naz, and Cat. They played 48 possessions together in the regular season, and they were great. 48 possessions isn't very much. We've seen 15 of this new 3 big lineup. 48 possessions together. Nearly half of them were with McDaniels at the 2 and Mike Conley. So exactly what I was saying, I didn't think would work well. They did it. And it was actually, that was only relatively successful. It was a plus 5.4 net rating in 21 possessions. The most successful lineup was with Naz, Cat, Rudy, Ant, and Mike Conley, which is one of the 2 versions that I just suggested with Naz, Randle, and Gobert. Either Conley and Alexander Walker or Conley and Ant, I think, are your best moves. And that was the best in very, very limited sample last season with the 3 bigs was Ant and Conley. So I think we could see a little bit more of it, but I think it'll be limited to maybe when Nickeil's available. And I think we see more of it with Nickeil than we do with Ant, just with the way that Nickeil plays versus how Ant plays. All right. I'm curious to see how that plays out. I'm curious to see if that's something that Chris Finch plays around with a little bit, and I think there's some real opportunity there. Let's close the show today by talking about WolvesSuns. We'll go back and revisit the matchup that we had back in early November, I believe, mid-November, between the Wolves and the Suns, and we'll peek ahead and take a look at what to expect tonight. We'll do all that here next. All right, the Timberwolves are in Phoenix to take on the Suns. The first visit to the desert this year. Minnesota last faced the Suns in November, and at the time, Minnesota came in at 7-6, and Phoenix came in at 9-4. This was a game at Target Center, and this was the one where Phoenix was up by 10 at halftime. Minnesota spent the second half fighting back, and ultimately won on a Julius Randle three-pointer. That was the buzzer beater. I think it was like a Sunday afternoon game. November 17th was the date, to be exact. And this is the second of 4 meetings between the Wolves and Suns right now in the standings. This game matters from a standings perspective. I mean, they all do, but right now Minnesota's 7th in the West, and they're a half game ahead of Phoenix. So if they beat Phoenix, they'll be a game and a half clear of Phoenix, and they'll have, at the very least, a tie in the tiebreaker. If they lose, they'll fall behind Phoenix to the tie in the 8th spot with Dallas, and they'll be tied 1-1 in the season series with Phoenix. So this is important from that perspective. Overall, the Phoenix matchup, I think, is still a pretty good one for Minnesota. Durant is officially questionable for the game. They released an injury report on Tuesday afternoon that said that Kevin Durant is questionable for the Wolves game. So we'll see if he's able to play. I would anticipate him playing. Otherwise, Phoenix is pretty healthy. So it's going to be a pretty full strength Phoenix team. The other notable lines from the first game between these two teams, Tyus Jones had 13 and 11 in his return to Minnesota. Devin Booker had 44 and 7. Minnesota did not do. Actually, thinking about, I remember at the time, the Wolves did an okay job on Booker. He just had a great shooting game. Grayson Allen really hurt them off the bench. 18 points, 5 rebounds, made 4 threes. He's been pretty up and down, banged up a little bit, but up and down for Phoenix this year. On the Wolves end, they had a pretty balanced performance overall. Julius Randle had 35 and 7 assists in this game, 5 made threes. I don't know when the last time Julius had 5 made threes was. It might have been this game. They got 24 and 6 assists from Anthony Edwards on just 14 shots, an efficient game from Ant. He was 6 of 7 on 2-point attempts in this game. Naz struggled. He had the worst plus minus of anyone on the Wolves by far. He had 13 points on 10 shots, was 1 of 6 on threes, turned it over a couple times. Dante DiVincenzo was great. It was one of the few games early in the season where he was very good. He had 15 points, made 5 threes. It was a plus 10 off the bench. So also overall in this one, Minnesota rebounded the ball terribly. They gave up 12 offensive rebounds to Phoenix. They only grabbed 32 total rebounds as a team. And that obviously an issue. They did do a good job of limiting free throw attempts for Phoenix. Phoenix only attempted 15 free throws in the game, and they're a top 3 free throw attempt team in terms of rate. And they're also, for what it's worth, I mean, not only like, if you look at attempts per game, they're like 12th because that doesn't factor in pace, right? So Phoenix plays pretty slow. So given the number of possessions they have, they generate a lot of free throw attempts, and they also make them. They're like 80% as a team because you got Kevin Durant out here shooting, 85% or whatever on free throws, and Devin Booker shooting 90% on free throws. So to defend without fouling is going to be a key of this game. They did it the first time around. Phoenix still scored 117 points because they made 14 threes on 45% shooting, and they had 12 offensive rebounds. But Minnesota did a good job of limiting free throw attempts for Phoenix. The offensive rebounding thing, I should point out, Phoenix is a bottom 5 offensive rebound rate team. Yusuf Nurkic isn't in the rotation anymore. They're probably going to trade him in the next week. So it's really Mason Plumlee's the guy you're looking out for on the offensive glass. Besides him, there's not a whole lot else. But I pointed out because it was such a big issue for Minnesota, early in the season in that first matchup. And I guess Nick Richards also, who's a new acquisition for Phoenix. He's been great on the glass so far in Phoenix, has been traditionally or over the course of his career in Charlotte. So look out for Nick Richards, look out for Mason Plumlee on the glass. Those are the guys you gotta be worried about. Again, not a huge part of Phoenix's MO, but was an issue in the first matchup. So defend without fouling, protect the defensive glass, are the two big ones. And then offensively, just get into a flow. And I don't know how else to like put a fine point on that. But maybe it's pushing the pace a little. Phoenix doesn't want to play fast. Like these guys aren't trying to run. Maybe it's being a bit more aggressive with pushing the pace. Phoenix doesn't turn you over a whole lot. They don't want to play fast. They're middle of the pack in terms of fouling. Like, I don't know. They're middle of the pack in terms of defending the 3-point line. It feels like a team you can score on if you play your game and just don't mess up. Hit open shots. I guess maybe that's the other piece of this is just get into a flow offensively, play your game, and make open shots. They're a mediocre defense. They're bottom third of the league defense, no matter how you slice it. And Minnesota should be able to get what they want out of this game. But they have to get into a flow. They can't just play iso ball. They can't be super sloppy because Phoenix isn't going to take it away unless you just give it to them. I mean, there's no Josh Okogie there anymore, right? He was part of that trade with Charlotte. So, like, you don't have Josh Okogie jumping passing lanes. You don't have to worry about that. Like, this is a winnable game for Minnesota, and I know Phoenix is on their heels, but, like, they have a negative point differential, which is the opposite of the Wolves. Like, the Wolves should be better than what their record is because of their point differential. Phoenix isn't as good as their 24-21 record would indicate. And ultimately, you know, maybe the trade they just made ends up being a good thing for them. And I'm curious to see what they do in the next week. But sitting here right now, this is a game that Minnesota should win. And if they can take care of their business by operating their offense in a smooth, non-sloppy way, which I realize is asking a lot, they should be all right in this game. They're currently favored by 1.5 in Phoenix over at FanDuel. And I wouldn't mind taking the Wolves at -1.5. I think they win this game by a bucket or two. Certainly a winnable game for the Wolves. I'm actually hosting the live postcast following the game, so you can catch it over on YouTube on the Locked On Sports Minnesota channel. We go live for road games probably as soon as 10 minutes following the final horn. So, I mean, what, like 10:30-ish or so Central Time? So myself and Jack Borman will do that, and then I'll also host the postcast on Thursday following that game too. So be sure to tune into both of those. And then I'll be back, of course, Thursday morning with the regular post-game podcast we'll do right here at Locked On Wolves. The audio of all the postcasts can also be found on this feed at Locked On Wolves audio too, if you can't catch it live after the game. All right, that's all we got for you today here on the show. Big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon at Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. Of course, you can also subscribe to the Locked On Wolves daily newsletter at LockedOnDaily.com. One stop for all Wolves coverage and NBA coverage delivered right to your inbox. Again, sign up for free at LockedOnDaily.com. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.